If you think a person's last will and testament is a sacred, unbreakable bond, you've never had to choose between a dead woman's delusions and your own children's survival. I didn't just steal a piece of paper. I erased a tragedy before it could swallow my family whole. Most people call me a saint for how I cared for her, but if they knew what I did in that darkened study, they'd call for my head. The air in Grandmother Evelyn's mansion always smelled of expensive rot and stagnant history, a suffocating reminder of wealth that never felt like mine. I spent 7 years changing bandages, enduring her sharp-tongued insults, and sacrificing my youth while she drifted further into the grip of the radiant path. They weren't a church. They were a black hole dressed in white robes, circling her like vultures waiting for the heart to stop. I watched from the shadows of the hallway as their advisor whispered into her ear, his eyes never leaving the antique safe behind her desk. The night Evelyn passed, the house felt colder, as if the walls themselves were exhaling a long-held breath of malice. I stood over her cooling body, feeling a hollow sense of duty rather than grief, my hands trembling as I reached for the spare key hidden in the base of a porcelain vase. The silence was absolute, punctured only by the frantic rhythm of my heart against my ribs. I knew the new will was in that safe, and I knew it was a death sentence for my 2 sons. As the door opened, the bright light of my flashlight illuminated the fresh document signed recently, and I saw the clause that would impact my family's finances, diverting funds to a new project. And in that soft, still moment, my concern grew, warm and heavy, as I realized my long service had been exchanged for a new company initiative. The situation felt overwhelming, like a quiet tide rising, making it difficult to process the information in the quiet room. I held the Radiant Path will in one hand, and the older, yellowed version, the one that named me the sole heir, in the other. The high contrast shadows in the room made my own reflection in the glass cabinet look like a stranger, someone cold and capable of anything. It wasn't about greed. It was about the grocery bills I couldn't pay, and the eviction notice tucked in my purse. I looked at the fireplace, the embers still glowing a faint, almost judgmental red, and I felt the weight of 1,000 generations of honesty pressing down on me. The sound of a floorboard creaking in the hallway made me jump, my skin crawling with the electricity of a cornered animal. I shoved the new will into the deep pocket of my cardigan, the paper crinkling like a loud accusation in the dead quiet of the estate. My mind raced through the consequences, prison, disgrace, the loss of my soul. But then I pictured my youngest son's face. I closed the safe, making sure the dial was set exactly as I found it, and walked toward the kitchen with the gait of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The old will sat on the mahogany dining table, looking official and righteous under the dim chandelier, a lie waiting to be validated. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind howl against the window panes like the ghost of Evelyn herself screaming in protest. Every moral lesson I had ever been taught screamed that I was committing an unforgivable sin against the dead. But the dead don't need a roof over their heads, and they don't wake up hungry in the middle of the night. I took a deep breath and walked to the backyard, where the trash incinerator waited. The flame caught the edge of the document, the heat turning the paper into tiny flakes that drifted away like fading fireflies. I watched the names of certain individuals crumble into ash, feeling a warm swirl of victory mixed with a soft ache of regret. And as the very last piece disappeared, I realized there was no turning back. I had made a commitment to keep quiet. The next morning, the lawyer arrived with a face as grim and clinical as a funeral shroud, unaware of the theater I had prepared. He sat in the high-backed velvet chair, peering through thick glasses at the outdated will I had found, prominently displayed on the desk. My hands were folded neatly in my lap, the picture of a grieving, exhausted granddaughter who had given everything to an ungrateful matriarch. I played the part of the victim perfectly, even as the stolen fortune sat inches away from my fingertips. The lawyer explained the estate process to Clara, while she focused on a tiny imperfection in the ceiling and let her thoughts drift to her paperwork, warm memories and worries, brushing softly through her mind like passing clouds. When the visitor arrived an hour later, his polite smile did not quite reach his eyes, which stayed watchful and keen, like little lanterns searching in the dark. He asked to see the most recent documents, his voice turning serious when I told him there were none. We stood together in the foyer, the morning sun stretching long, gentle shadows across our faces, as though the light itself were listening in on two people sharing sensitive information. He accused me of miscommunication, his words direct and concerned, fluttering in the air like startled wings. But I remained firm, holding my ground with the calm detachment of someone who had already completed a task, steady as a stone in a quiet stream. "She promised us the light, Clara, and the light requires the resources she swore to provide," he hissed, stepping into my personal space. I didn't flinch, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise. I told him that perhaps Evelyn had realized the truth in her final moments. That family was the only thing that actually mattered. He left with a threat lingering in the air, but as the heavy oak door clicked shut, I knew the law was on my side, even if God wasn't. I walked into the kitchen and made a cup of tea, my movements robotic and precise as I tried to process the reality of my new life. The house was mine, the money was mine, and my children's future was secured behind a wall of scorched paper and strategic silence. I looked at my reflection in the chrome toaster, seeing a woman who had traded her integrity for security and didn't yet know if the bargain was worth it. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, accusing presence that followed me from room to room. By the time my kids came home from school, the masks were back on, and the saintly Clara was back in character. They hugged me, sensing the tension but thinking it was just grief. Their innocent smiles glowing like tiny lanterns, reminding me why I had made such a difficult choice. I watched them run through the hallways of a mansion they didn't know was a place of concern, their footsteps echoing softly, and I felt a sharp little pang of isolation. I had saved them from hardship, but I had also built their lives on a quiet, hidden foundation of secrecy that they could never, ever know about. The notary arrived that afternoon, his actions precise as he prepared the final signatures for the estate transfer. Each mark of his pen felt significant as it finalized the legal process. I signed my name multiple times, my handwriting firm even though I felt overwhelmed. I was now a woman of means, recognized in the community, and someone who had acted against a final request. The first week of my new life felt like walking through a field of soft traps. Every luxury a quiet reminder of the choice I'd made. The townspeople brought food and sympathy, their voices gentle and hushed, carrying a kind of reverence that made my skin prickle. They praised my generous spirit while I sat in the sunlit room, gazing at the exact spot on the rug where I had stood when the plan changed. Everything I'm so sorry for your loss felt like a touch, a warm reminder that the woman they admired was now a memory I had set aside to make room for a newcomer. In a warm, gently glowing tone, soft as moonlit storytelling, yet reading every word exactly as written, the radiant path didn't fade into the shadows as I'd hoped. They began a campaign of psychological warfare that turned my sanctuary into a cage. Unmarked vans sat at the end of the driveway, their headlights cutting through the night like searching eyes, and my phone began to buzz with cryptic messages about the weight of a soul. I stood by the window in the dark, the contrast of the cold moonlight making me look like a prisoner in my own home. I realized then that while I had the legal title to the estate, the cult believed they had a moral title to my peace of mind. I was back in Evelyn's study. I looked through her old journals, searching for a reason, any proof that she had been forced or influenced. Instead, I read her writings about her family history and how her money was a powerful force that I would diminish with my ordinary nature. Her words were harsh, challenging, and full of a strong dislike that made my hands tremble as I held the book. "You were never going to give us a chance, were you?" I whispered to the empty room, my voice cracking in the hollow space. I realized then that my crime wasn't just about money. It was a final desperate act of rebellion against a woman who had tried to erase her own grandchildren from history. I felt a surge of defensive rage, a fire that briefly burned away the guilt as I looked at the photos of my sons on the mantelpiece. I told myself that a grandmother who would leave her blood on the street didn't deserve the dignity of her final will being honored. The pressure intensified when the local newspaper ran a feature on Evelyn's philanthropic intentions, quoting the cult leader who claimed she had promised them a transformative gift. I read the article in the kitchen, the harsh fluorescent light making the newsprint look stark and accusatory. My neighbors began to whisper at the grocery store, their eyes darting away when I approached, the seeds of doubt finally taking root. The narrative was shifting from grieving granddaughter to suspicious beneficiary, and I knew I had to act before the whispers turned into an investigation. I met with Brother Thomas, the group's leader, at a public cafe for our discussion. The bright lights provided a feeling of security. He sat opposite me, his look unchanging, but revealing a wish for the vast resources I now managed. He did not request the funds. He claimed them as a correction of heavenly purpose, his voice quiet and steady among the cafe sounds. I felt closely observed, my every reaction being studied for any indication of vulnerability or an error in speaking. "We know there was a second will, Clara," he said, leaning in so close I could smell the peppermint on his breath. I laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that felt like breaking glass, and told him that his visions wouldn't hold up in a court of law. I was being brutally honest in my defiance, even as my stomach did somersaults and my palms grew slick with sweat. I told him to stay away from my family, or I'd use my new fortune to bury his church in legal fees until they were nothing but a memory. He left with a smirk that chilled me to the bone, leaving me alone in the crowded cafe feeling more isolated than ever. I drove home in a blur, the rainy streets reflecting the neon signs and distorted streaks of red and blue, mirroring my fractured state of mind. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw my sons playing in the yard, their laughter a stark contrast to the darkness I carried in my chest. I realized that my secret was a ticking clock, and every day I kept it, the explosion would be more devastating for the very people I was trying to protect. That night, I had a dream where Evelyn was at the end of my bed. She was holding something that looked burned, cradling it gently, as if it carried a story she could not speak. She did not say a word, but she pointed toward my children's room. Her face filled with such deep distress it made my heart tighten. I woke up feeling like I could not breathe. The room was dark, and the shadows seemed to shift softly around me. I went to the safe and touched it, wondering if the money was somehow dangerous and if it might bring trouble into our home. I began to see the reversal in my own mind. Was I the protector of my children? Or was I a villain who had robbed a woman of her final agency? The moral gray area wasn't a distant thought anymore. It felt like a deep, shadowy swamp I was slowly sinking into, and every choice I made pulled me a little deeper into the mud. I started making anonymous donations to local charities, just hoping to somehow balance the scales of my soul, but each offering felt hollow, like placing feathers on a weight that wouldn't budge. You can't buy back a conscience once you've traded it away for a zip code and a trust fund. The tension at home became a physical weight, making the ceilings feel lower and the hallways longer. And my oldest son, with his father's keen intuition, looked up at me one evening and asked why I seemed so scared every time the doorbell rang. I snapped at him sharp, defensive like a sudden crack in quiet air, and the way he flinched, the way hurt washed over his face, felt heavier than anything Brother Thomas could ever threaten. That look of betrayal, oh, it ached, because I could feel it happening. I was becoming the very thing I hated, someone tangled in secrets, someone with a hair-trigger temper, turning our home into something fragile, something that felt like a house of glass. A week later, a private investigator knocked on my door, his badge glinting in the harsh afternoon sun like a warning. He wasn't there for the cult. He was there on behalf of a distant cousin who had been cut out of the original will and smelled blood in the water. He asked questions about the timeline of Evelyn's final days, his eyes scanning the foyer for any sign of a lie, any crack in the facade. I stood there, my back straight and my voice a clinical monotone, realizing that the inheritance of silence was going to be a lifelong war. "I am just completing my assigned task, ma'am," he said politely. I watched him return to his vehicle, the shadows stretching long and gentle across the ground like tired arms at the end of the day. The situation felt overwhelming, and Clara felt strained by the need to manage a significant project. I wandered into the kitchen and held the counter firmly, letting the cool surface steady me as I considered that the most difficult aspect of managing a large undertaking is that it requires ongoing attention. The final blow came when I found a letter Evelyn had hidden in an old coat pocket, one I'd somehow missed in my frantic search. It wasn't a legal document at all. It was a small, handwritten note meant only for me, carrying a flick of regret for her coldness and a hope that I'd understand her choice one day. And oh, the honesty in her shaky handwriting felt like a hot iron pressed right against my heart, melting away my last excuse of calling her purely delusional. I sank onto the closet floor, surrounded by her old furs and the soft, familiar smell of cedar. And there, in that quiet little world we once shared, I wept for the bridge I had burned while I was still standing on it. I looked at the note, and then at the matches in my hand, the same ones I'd used to burn the will. The choice was the same as it had always been: the truth that destroys or the lie that sustains. I realized that my children's lives were built on a foundation of ash, and if I ever let the wind blow too hard, the whole structure would collapse. I tucked the note into my pocket, the crinkle of the paper a constant, sharp reminder that the mercy clause I'd created for myself was actually a life sentence without parole. The private investigator's visits became a rhythmic torture, a reminder that the world was waiting for me to trip over my own shadow. He returned on a Tuesday, his eyes like cold flint as he asked why the security cameras in the study had been malfunctioning on the night of Evelyn's death. I leaned against the doorframe, my expression a mask of cold indifference, and told him that old houses have old problems. Inside, my pulse was a frantic hammer, and the air felt thick with the clinical scent of the bleach I had used to scrub a history that refused to stay buried. My youngest son's school contacted me to say his tuition payment was processed. This should have been a happy moment, but instead, I felt a sense of guilt. Sitting in my car at the school, I watched the children enjoying themselves, their laughter drifting through the air like tiny bells. It struck me that their playtime and joy were indirectly supported by a terrible event involving another person. The bright sunlight shimmered across my windshield, momentarily obscuring my vision, and I felt a strong, aching impulse to go to the police and reveal everything. But then, my son smiled at me, his little face filled with a sense of safety and happiness he had never known before. And in that moment, I held the steering wheel so tightly that my hands grew numb. On a rainy Thursday, a group left an envelope at my home. It held pictures of me at a location that night. The pictures were unclear, taken in black and white, making me appear as a vague figure in the dim light. And then, almost like a whisper, cutting through the hush of a sleepy forest, a person called shortly after, their tone direct and demanding. They proposed a financial arrangement in return for the original picture files. They were no longer requesting, they were gently but firmly showing the boundaries of the structure they had created for my current circumstances, a difficult position that had become quite severe. I met him in the garden, the stormy horizon reflecting the ongoing discussions we were having over a project. And there we stood, beneath those heavy clouds, the air humming like a story waiting to unfold. I didn't bring a checkbook. I brought a recording of our previous meeting where he had made some strong statements, a sharp counter move that caught him off guard. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, until it felt as though the sky itself wanted to listen in. We stood there in the downpour, two colleagues discussing the same task, the rain washing away the pretense of politeness and professional duty. I told him that if I lost this project, I was taking his radiant path plan with me, disrupting it with the same focus I used on the proposal. He backed down, the shock on his face a visual metaphor for the power shift, but the victory tasted like copper and bile. As I watched his car disappear into the gray mist, I realized that I had become a master of the very manipulation I once despised in Evelyn. I wasn't the perfect caretaker anymore. I was a strategist who had traded her peace for a high-stakes game of survival. The house behind me, with its moody shadows and locked doors, didn't feel like a home. It felt like a monument to a secret that would outlive me. Years passed, and the saintly Clara became a pillar of the community, a woman whose wealth was only matched by her quiet, intense expressions of grief. My children grew up, went to elite colleges, and started families of their own, never once questioning where the blessing had truly come from. I sat at my granddaughter's graduation, looking at the bright, hopeful faces of the next generation, and felt the crushing weight of the unspoken truth. I had built a paradise on a foundation of theft, and the irony was that I was the only one who had to live in the hell of knowing it. In the quiet hours of the night, I still find myself standing in the study, staring at the safe that started it all. The silence is no longer a vacuum. It's a conversation between me and the woman I betrayed, a dialogue of sharp, brutally honest regrets. I realize now that the mercy clause didn't just save my kids, it doomed me to a life of perpetual performance, a role I can never step out of until I'm in a casket of my own. I chose their future over my soul, and every morning I wake up and decide to make that same terrible choice again. The final irony of my inheritance is that I can never truly own it. It owns me, dictating my friends, my movements, and my very thoughts. I am a prisoner of the heart flame, the fire that burned the truth and left me with nothing but the cold, hard ashes of security. As I look out at the stormy horizon one last time, I wonder if Evelyn is laughing from wherever she is, watching me guard her money with the same bitterness she once did. The reversal is complete. I am the victim of my own success, a villain draped in the robes of a martyr. I often wonder if my children would have preferred a poorer mother with a clean heart, or if they're better off with the comfortable lie I've fed them. I see my own cold determination reflected in my son's eyes when he talks about business. And I realize that the inheritance I passed on wasn't just money. It was a ruthless instinct for survival. My secret is my legacy, and I will take it to the grave, leaving behind a family that thrives on a truth they can never afford to hear. I saved my children's lives by destroying a dead woman's final wish, and now I live in a mansion built of lies. If you were one signature away from changing your family's destiny forever, would you have the courage to be the villain